He really thinks he's the real life Joker. I go into this interview. Before we could even press record on the camera, he said, "So, yeah, you can ask me whatever you want, but, I'm just going to tell you right now, yes, I did it. I'm guilty of the murder, and I'm guilty of a lot of other stuff they don't know about." I always knew that I wanted to be involved in investigating crime in some way. And when I was in college, I sort of came to the conclusion that I didn't have the stomach to be, an actual detective. And that's when I started learning about, investigative reporters. It's so funny though, looking back, because first of all, I think I do have the stomach for it. I think I underestimated myself when I was, 18 years old. And I also had a very naive, sort of fantasized view about what it would be like to be an investigative reporter covering crime. I very much envisioned myself working side by side with law enforcement. I thought that, okay, yes, I won't have a badge, but they'll basically treat me like I do. And, I'll get to go underneath the yellow tape and all that. And of course, the reality is that is not what it's really like. But yes, that's essentially how I decided I wanted to become a crime reporter. I just thought this is a great way for me to still be involved in criminal investigations. I also had always loved storytelling, so I thought it would be a really neat combination of the two.
Right. Well, so if you kind of came up with this at that age and you were going to college, did you go to college for journalism
Yes.
or?
Yes.
Okay.
So, yes, I went to college for journalism, and then I went to graduate school for journalism as well.
Were you actively doing things while this was, while you were getting your education, or, did you wait, get out of school and then start pursuing different, either job opportunities or I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I had internships in journalism and whatnot while I was in school. But, that internships don't really prepare you. Like journalism, being a reporter is very much a job in which you can go to school forever for it. It's comical that I went to graduate school for it, looking back, because you truly learn more one day on the actual job than you will, in years of sitting in a classroom talking about it. So yes, when I was 23 years old, when I was done with school, I got my first real reporting job working in local news in Bakersfield, California. And I picked Bakersfield. First of all, when you're starting out, you don't have that many options, right? You have to start in a small market, a small news market.
You can't go straight to the Miami Herald.
No, you cannot.
Fellas, I'm ready.
Right.
We've been waiting for you.
Exactly. And I wished at the time, of course. But I had three options when I graduated. I could go to a very small town in Montana, where I would have been a news anchor. So just sitting behind the desk and reading the newscasts. Or I could go be a reporter in Palm Springs or a reporter in Bakersfield. I quickly ruled out being an anchor because, I didn't want to be the one reading the news. I wanted to be out there, like hitting the streets, knocking on doors, being an actual reporter. And then when it came to picking between Palm Springs and Bakersfield, all my friends thought I was insane, that I was even weighing the two options. They're like, it's such an obvious choice. Palm Springs. We love Palm Springs. Palm Springs is beautiful and fun. But that was not, what I was basing my reporting career off of. So I picked Bakersfield because I knew that there was a high crime rate there. So I was pretty eager to jump in.
So what kind of crimes were you investigating? Are you just like some police departments put out like a press release and that sort of thing? Are you just showing up and getting the press release and rewriting it, or are you getting tips on, different types of crime and then trying to follow up on them? How did that work?
So getting a press release and going off of that is kind of like the last resort. Right. You don't want that, because by the time law enforcement sends out a press release, the crime scene's already wrapped up. It's kind of over. Ideally, as a reporter, you want to be there as everything is unfolding. So we listen to police scanners, in the newsroom 24/7. And there's always someone in the newsroom. The newsroom is never empty. So there's always someone listening to the police scanners. So that's how we get a majority of stories. Is we hear something's going on, we race out to the address we're hearing. Sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it's something huge. You kind of never know. You really have to go there in person, and that's something that I loved so much about local news, and I miss this aspect of it so much now that I'm no longer in it. Is the action of it all. We just heard something big. Race out there. Get out there with your camera guy. Try to find witnesses, scope out the scene, all that stuff. And so when I was in Bakersfield, and when I first started, especially, I was covering everything. It was a lot of traffic accidents, DUI crashes, a lot of homicides, always right off the bat, missing persons cases, sexual assault investigations, a lot of child homicides. Really, when I look back, I think that I covered every type of crime you could imagine. I was covering animal hoarding cases. The list goes on, but I always wanted to focus on homicide cases and missing persons cases.
Okay. So you show up, it's taped off. It's not like you're walking through the crime scene.
Right.
You show up, you talk to the neighbors, you ask the police officers, the detectives that they'll talk, you get, whatever you can squeeze out of them, because they're probably not saying that much.
Oh yeah. No, they never. Yeah. And they're busy, and you have to respect that, right? I quickly learned at 23 years old, okay, I'm not a detective. They have a very important job to do. I respect that. And when you go to a crime scene, you also, that's something else. You imagine what that's going to be like so much, right? Before you actually do that. Like when I was in school, I very much imagined, how exhilarating that might be, to have that opportunity to actually go to a scene as things are unfolding. But very quickly, I learned, okay, you can't look at it as this is, oh, wow, this is exciting, when someone's life was just taken, and there's a family out there that's at this exact moment getting the worst news that anyone could ever imagine receiving, right? This is real. And it's very intense, because a lot of times when you're out there at a scene, family members show up. And sometimes you're there as they are finding out what happened to their loved one. And it's, I still remember the first time that I witnessed that, and it was absolutely surreal.
What was it a shooting? Was it?
It was a DUI crash, and it was a teenage girl. Her boyfriend had been driving. It was probably 4:30 in the morning when we were out there. I was working the morning shift at that point, so I started work very, very early. And her mom, it actually makes me. I haven't thought about it in so long.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's weird because when you're doing the job, like you're so you can't cry when you're doing the job, right? It's just, yeah. So it's crazy to me that I'm more emotional thinking about it now. How many years has been 8 years or more after the fact than I was at the time. But yeah, I remember the mom just running down the street, just screaming. And running up to me and saying, at that point she didn't know anything. So she was asking me, what happened, who is it, before then an officer saw what was going on and an officer came and talked to her. But it was, and then to be right there next to her as she's getting the confirmation, this is her daughter and her daughter's gone. It's surreal. It's surreal. So, but I apologize.
All right.
I'm not an emotional person, but sometimes sometimes I surprise myself, I guess.
Oh, listen, you couldn't have made me cry when I was 19 or 20, 25, and I'm 54 now, and I tear up all the time.
Yeah.
For no reason. I think you get older and it just at those little things that I don't know if I didn't have experience with them or what the issue was. They just had no effect on me at all. But now it hits me all the time.
Yeah.
Which is horrible. So you've gone there, you've gone to the scene, you've taken notes, you've maybe talked to some people. Do you then order the police report, and do you get the police report right away?
No. So the way it works is, at least when I was working in Bakersfield, California, we reporters were not able to have access to a police report unless the case was considered closed, or if the district attorney's office had filed charges. So, once an individual is charged, then the law enforcement agency investigating the case submits their report to the courthouse. So then that report is filed in court and we could request it from the court. That being said, these reports are always heavily redacted. So, you're looking at a page and like 40% of it is blacked out. You have to really get good at reading in between the lines and sort of piecing together the information that is not redacted.
Do you ever try and reach out to the person? Like if it's, let's say it's an investigation with someone, but there's, an interview with someone, and you kind of figure out like who that person is, but it's redacted. Do you ever reach out to that person and say, hey, I got the report. I was wondering if I could go over it with you to try and piece it together, or?
Oh, of course. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, oftentimes I would say you can figure out a decent amount of who's being discussed in a police report. And usually, the way for me as a reporter, I would always get most of my information from the victim's loved ones in a homicide case or missing persons investigation. So, and oftentimes the family, not always, but often the family has a pretty good idea of who they think did it. So, having the reports, for me, the benefit was usually getting to see if law enforcement was backing up what I had already been hearing from family members, neighbors, and whatnot.
So, I'm sure most of these are just, you go out to a crime scene, you write up 500 words, 1,000 words, and you don't, maybe later when they arrest somebody, there's a follow-up article, once they're, so maybe there's 4 or 5 articles. Have you ever created one while you were working as a reporter that ended up kind of being a series where it was an ongoing,
Oh, yes. No, absolutely. And I think, that was something that was so special about the news station that I worked at in Bakersfield, that I had a boss who would let me do that, because you're right. Oftentimes in local news, it's, we're there to cover it when the story's breaking, man shot on this street at this time. And then, maybe a follow up if there's an arrest, but that's it. But I hate that. I hate that, because it's like, what's the story? There's no story there. Like, what do you actually, you're reporting, that's so the bare minimum. So yes. So working for a boss who encouraged me to really tap into my passion about following cases, as deep as they could go. That was, the greatest gift. And there were quite a few cases that I was covering for years. And the podcast, my Bakersfield 3 podcast, that's a direct result of a case that I started covering in local news in Bakersfield. And, I was doing stories on that case constantly, probably at least one a month for a couple years. So, and then there were other cases where I was allowed to go off air for months at a time and do nothing but focus on this one individual case and really investigate it.
Do any of those, other than the podcast, which we can talk about, obviously, but other than that, does any one of them stand out to you that?
Oh my gosh. Yes. It's so hard to pick. I would love to talk about them all, but then we'll be here all day. But the first case that I ever really dug into is a cold case that it unfortunately is still unsolved. And it is the murder of a woman named Kathleen Heisey, who was a beloved elementary school principal. She was just, she was really a character. It's so cheesy when people say someone's a pillar in the community, but in this case, she really was. She was a lot of people knew her. She had a very bold personality. She was great with kids. She lived alone. Her children they were both young adults at that time. So, she lived alone at the end of a cul-de-sac in a nice neighborhood. It was a summer night in 1998 that someone went into her home and not only murdered her, brutally stabbed her to death, but then they posed her body. And it appears that, whoever the killer was, that they were pretty comfortable spending some time inside her home after the murder. They didn't take anything. There was still cash. She was going on vacation soon to Mexico, and she had taken out a bunch of cash and had it on her kitchen counter that was left untouched. It's a haunting case, and I became obsessed with it to the point where it was all consuming. And I actually felt like at a certain point I needed to take a step back, because it was just all I could think about for a really long time. So
did the police have any leads at all? Or?
Yes. Which this was the first time I understood that you could have a case where there are too many suspects. I always thought if the case is unsolved, that means they don't have any suspects. They don't know. They've got no clue who did it. But oftentimes law enforcement actually does have a good idea who did it. They just can't make the case. But then a case like Kathleen's, there are several individuals who look suspicious, who are rightfully so persons of interest. And that can be really tricky when, for multiple reasons. I don't want to get too into the weeds about it, but the biggest thing is, let's say they make an arrest. They arrest, one of the suspects. The first thing that suspect's defense attorney is going to bring up in a trial is, well, look at these two other guys. Look at how suspicious they look, and right there, that's
what about the ex-husband? What about the ex-husband? What about so-and-so? He called, 20 minutes earlier.
Exactly.
Right. Reasonable doubt.
Exactly. And what was so fascinating about Kathleen's case is, among the persons of interest, law enforcement never wants to call anyone a suspect until they're actually charged. So I'm always reminding myself, gotta use that term, persons of interest, even though it drives me crazy because everyone's a person of interest, right? It's so vague. But anyhow, among the persons of interest, you have a disgruntled coworker of Kathleen's, a teacher who worked at her elementary school, who was apparently upset with her because she had written a negative review about him. And then you also have a suspected serial killer who's currently serving a life sentence for another murder. He's a convicted serial rapist. And while he has only been convicted of one murder, there are a handful that law enforcement has investigated him for. So, there's just such a spectrum, right? Like you have the possibility that this horrific crime was committed by a stranger who's, a sadistic serial killer. And then there's also the possibility that it was very personal and, it was someone who knew her well and is not someone you would expect would ever do something like this. So it's a fascinating case. It's a fascinating case. I did a lot of reporting on it.
Did you go through, were you able to look at the law enforcement notes and the police reports, or is it just
no? Since the case is unsolved, that was something too that it took me a while to understand as a reporter, because from my point of view, I'm like, okay, well, the case is, X amount years old. Nearly, I think it had been unsolved, I think, for 18 years when I started looking into it. And her family, was telling me, we haven't had a detective reach out to us and, we can't remember the last time a detective reached out to us. So I'm thinking, okay, the case is not active. No one's actively investigating it, right? But that doesn't matter if law enforcement considers the case unsolved. Then it's considered open. And then it's pretty impossible to get access to any police reports or whatnot. But I still, it's such a fascinating, shocking case that there were a lot of people that were willing to speak with me about it, because it's just, it's one of those cases that people really can't forget, which in Bakersfield is a big deal, because unfortunately in Bakersfield, there's so many homicides that they can blend together. Many of them, unfortunately, are not memorable to the general public. So it is significant when you have a case that people just can't forget about.
So the podcast that you're doing, it's based on a case that started when you were a reporter. Was it one of the, did the crime happen and you showed up at the very beginning, or was it already had it already happened when you came in?
So when I came in, so it started. So the basis of the case is you have three friends who went missing or were murdered back to back within a 31-day period. So Micah Holsenbake, he was the first to go missing.
What time frame is this?
I apologize. This is spring 2018.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. So this was
I thought you were going to say this was 10 years ago or something.
No. Yes. No, I covered a lot of cold cases, but this was a case where, yes, I was covering it right from the start. So It's the end of March 2018. Micah Holsenbake goes missing. About 2 weeks after that, his friend James Kolstad is murdered. And I covered James's homicide day one before we knew it was James, before we knew anything. Like, we don't know, a lot of times when we first get out there, we don't necessarily know the name of the victim or any circumstances. We just know there's been a homicide. So 2 weeks after James is murdered, his and Micah's friend, Bailey Despot, goes missing. So you have the three friends, two who go missing back to back, and in between their disappearances, their friend is murdered.
Bailey's a female, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just making sure.
So yes, and Micah and James are men. So yes, when I first started looking into the cases in terms of connecting that these three people knew each other, it was June 2018. So Bailey had been missing a little over a month. Micah had been missing a little over 2 months.
Okay. So how did you connect that this was an odd? I mean, these are friends. These aren't like, a married couple and, their child. I mean, these are all should kind of all be separate events. Like, what connected all of this to realize, like, hey, all three of these people were friends. Something's odd.
Well, and something to note as well is while they were friends, while they all knew each other, it wasn't like the three of them were best friends and they were together 24/7. It wasn't like when initially when Micah went missing and then James was murdered and then Bailey goes missing, that everyone's like, oh my gosh, these three. It wasn't that straightforward, if you will. So when I first started looking into the case, I had gotten a search warrant I would go to court once or twice a week and request search warrants that were filed in the court and read through them. And this one particular search warrant I was going through was about a felon. It was an investigation into a felon being in possession of a firearm when legally, he's not supposed to.
Right.
And that's, there's hundreds of warrants for that. That's not anything. I'm not going to go put that on the news. Right. But I'm still, I had a habit of still reading through every single one. And there was one line in that particular search warrant that said that this individual that they were investigating for the unlawful possession of a firearm, that he was living with a woman that had now been missing for a few weeks, Bailey Despot.
Right.
So I'm just looking into then her case and her disappearance. And frankly, there were red flags about this guy that she was living with right off the bat. So, and a lot of times when you have someone who's gone missing under suspicious circumstances, the number one suspect is the person they were romantically involved in.
Right.
Right. So the guy looks suspicious.
I get it. I'm married. There's sometimes.
Right. Yes, of course. So, and this guy looks suspicious on top of that. So it initially seems like, okay, this could be a tragic, but all too familiar case. Right. So that same day, I reach out to Bailey's mom, and that is when Bailey's mom tells me that about a month before Bailey disappeared, she had a friend named Micah who also went missing. And now I'm thinking, okay, that's unusual. I'm not instantly thinking these two are connected, but I'm certainly thinking, this is something that should be looked into. So then I reach out to Micah's mom to get more information about his disappearance. And that's when Micah's mom tells me that the two of them knew this guy, James, who was murdered. So, now I'm thinking, okay, there's the potential that you have these three cases that are linked.
That's, statistically, it depends on how close they were, but it's getting to be odder and odder. But hey,
Yes.
I do have another question real quick. I mean, just in context, because while you're talking, I'm thinking, how do you solve this? What I'm saying, like, what's the connections? Is it a love triangle? Is it? But what I'll also think is, how old are these people, and are they kind of sketchy individuals? Like, are they into drugs? Are they just normal? They all have full-time jobs. Are they college students? Like, what types of people are these?
So that's a great question. Bailey was much younger than Micah and James, which was unusual. Even, all their families thought it was unusual initially. But so Bailey was 20 years old when she went missing. Micah was 34 and James was 38. So that's a significant age difference between Bailey and Micah and James. But, I found out that Bailey was just, she was going to parties where there was a much older crowd. So a lot of the people that Bailey was hanging around with were older. And the individual that she was living with and dating at the time of her disappearance, he was more than twice her age. And he was married, and she was living in his home with him and his wife and their children. So that's,
this is an odd situation.
It's an odd situation. And so what I also found out about Bailey, Micah, and James early on is all three of them had really great upbringings. And all three of them at some point in their adult lives appeared to be thriving. Micah was a successful financial advisor at Wells Fargo. He was married. He had a child. James was a very successful entrepreneur. He had a home near the beach, on the beach with an ocean view in San Diego. But, before he was 30, he had a young family as well. And then Bailey, she was only 20 years old when she went missing, but she, she was always a great student. She was going to college. She was studying to become a veterinarian. She had by all appearances, she had a good life that, anyone would want for their young adult child. But there were tragic circumstances that occurred in all three of their lives shortly before their disappearances and murder that really veered them onto a dark path. For Micah and James, they both were prescribed opioids after both having surgery for different medical issues. And, like so many people in the United States, they eventually became addicted to the painkillers that they were prescribed. And, that from there they became, once they were cut off from these prescription painkillers, then they're turning to the streets to find something equivalent. Right. So that, really changed what their lives looked like recently before Micah went missing and James was murdered. And it changed the crowd of people they were around. And then for Bailey was gang raped. And after that happened, her loved ones say, she just wasn't the same. She struggled immensely. And she then started hanging out with a rougher crowd and just was doing things that her family just couldn't understand, including, when she started dating, a 41-year-old man who was still legally married with his wife still living in his home, and their 3 kids. And his oldest kid, is only a few years younger than her. Just things that her loved ones were like, what are you doing? What's going on? They just felt like, after that traumatic sexual assault, she just kind of lost herself.
Okay. So what is the next? Well, this is 2018. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
you have cell phones. Like, you can't
Yeah.
disappear. Like, you got to chuck your phone. It's not like they said, you know what? That's it. California's not for me. I'm moving to Florida. Like, you would know, like, you have to shut your phone off. You have to stop all. I mean, now it's pretty easy to determine, no, this person is missing. Something happened.
Right. Right. Oh, and I mean, absolutely. For both Bailey and Micah, there were no signs of life from the time, in both cases, family knows the last day that anyone saw them and spoke with them. And after that day, there's nothing. There's no phone calls. There's no text messages. There's no cell phone activity. There's no, financial transactions. There's no sightings, nothing. So, but that said, law enforcement oftentimes will still say, sometimes, people, you have the right to disappear. And sometimes people want to start anew. There are three moms. The podcast, my podcast, The Bakersfield Three, a lot of it is about the incredible work that their three mothers did together. They really, they did their own investigation. And a big part of why they did their own investigation was because in the beginning, they were hearing from investigators, we think Bailey and Micah are in Mexico, probably together. They probably ran off to be in Mexico together.
Where are they getting that? Or are they just trying to get him to go away?
It's tough to say. There are a lot of people that go missing and they are found just fine. So I can understand from law enforcement's perspective why they're not in a case when you have missing adults, and especially missing adults that had issues in their lives, right? At this point in time, Bailey and Micah and James, they, were hanging out with some questionable characters. James and Micah are dealing with addiction. Law enforcement, there are a lot of cases like that where they're like, okay, sometimes these people, they just disappear, but nothing's wrong. They're fine. They resurface in days or weeks or months. So it's hard. It's hard. But
I can see somebody going on a drunken bender for 2 or 3 weeks, but it's been 3 to 6 months. They're not using their email, their credit cards, their bank accounts, their cell phones. No inquiries have been made on their credit reports. This person's deceased. They're not missing, other than the fact that we haven't found their body yet. You see. So I mean, I understand. Maybe you don't want to say anything bad about law enforcement, but clearly these people are missing. I mean, they're deceased. Something's happened. My money's on they're not showing up okay in the future.
Right.
What did the moms do? So the moms get together. They get together at Starbucks. They start writing up a calendar. What was the last text? What was this? What was that? Like, I mean, what do they come up with? How do they proceed?
So the three of them. So when I spoke with the three of them separately, I realized that all three of them were already doing their own investigating. And I thought, I got to get the three of them in a room together,
nice.
Right? Because we're looking at the possibility that the three cases are connected.
I may have a story here at some point in the future.
Well, I knew I had a story. Right. The story was, there's this potential connection between the three cases, but I absolutely thought getting the three moms in a room together. I don't know. I guess I can't explain it. I don't know how to put it into words, but I knew I had to do it. And I would say pretty immediately The second they're all sitting at that table together, they just clicked. They just clicked, and they start, oh, well, I did a background check on this person. Well, so did I. I found out this. Oh, well, but I need to figure out this piece of missing information. And then one of the moms would say, well, I have it. The three of them together really started connecting the dots. And they also had different skill sets. So then it was really powerful to combine their different skill sets. So they started, they made a massive timeline of their kids' last movements, the people who their kids were last seen with, were hanging out with regularly, all of their last movements. I remember one of the things they did early on was they made a huge diagram of all these people that were in the common social circle that the three, Micah, Bailey, and James, were all in, right? Because coming into it for me, I'm like, wait a second. There's so many people that these people, the moms wanted to look at everyone. Everyone was a suspect. And it was overwhelming because there were so many people. So yeah, the moms just started making this crazy diagram with photos and people's criminal records. And, it was everything they did was so thorough and so extensive because no one is going to care more than a mother. Right. So they're not worried about clocking in or clocking out. I mean, they lived and breathed nothing other than trying to investigate what had happened to their children.
Who did they, I'm sure once you start making the lists of friends and then, 3 people show up on 2 lists and, 2 people show up on all 3 lists and you're like, okay, well, now we're down to, we got 2 people that we know all of these same individuals. Is that basically what happened? Would they kind of?
Yes. And then, they were going and interviewing these people. Sometimes they were interviewing people that were scary individuals. One of Bailey's mom, she was known to go to the roughest parts of town, even though we had no reason to believe that Bailey had ever been there or anything like that. Bailey's mom she wanted to go literally everywhere she could think of and pass out missing flyers of her daughter. And she also developed this, this idea that criminals talk to each other. And, there could be a criminal involved in my daughter's disappearance. So I need to talk to every single criminal I can meet. She made a habit of hanging outside of the jail and would wait for people to get released. And, she would go up to them. She would hand them snacks, candy. She'd give them, she'd always carry a bunch of quarters if they wanted to use the payphone, make a call. And in exchange, she would just ask that they would take her daughter's missing flyer and be on the lookout and call her if they knew anything. And I thought it was fascinating that there were quite a few individuals who did not want to talk to law enforcement, but were willing to talk to the 3 moms.
So where did this lead?
Well, I can't give it away, but I will say.
Well, how about this? How long did the investigation take? Did they do this?
They're still investigating. And without giving anything away, I would say there's there are some answers, but there are still things that we don't know that we really need answers on. And that was part of why I created the podcast, is in hopes that, getting the story out there will help get the answers that we still need. So there was a murder trial that took place in May 2022. And I've been, I would say it's probably the case that I've been covering consistently for the longest period of time. It's been about 5.5 years now. And, I'm right there. I'm very committed to being there, helping the moms any way I can, until we have all the answers that we need to really understand what happened to all three, Bailey, Micah, and James, and why.
So I'm assuming the person charged with murder is it Bailey's? Bailey was charged with the boyfriend. Maybe was charged with murder or something, or.
I'm trying to think how I can answer this question without I can't really answer the question without giving away the whole thing.
So someone was arrested was it for all three murders or one murder?
One.
And was that person found guilty or not guilty?
You really want me to give everything?
I don't think that's everything. I think that's public records. I could probably look it up.
There's someone in prison.
Okay.
And yes, no, of course people can Google the case, and it.
I'm just wondering, okay, so whatever. Let's assume, okay, there's a definite connection. Obviously, this person did not admit it. They went to trial. They said, I didn't do it. There's some evidence, enough evidence to put on a trial. They're tried. They're found guilty. They go to jail. But does law enforcement believe that there's a connection between all of them?
Law enforcement believes there's a connection between two of them,
okay.
which I agree with. I think Bailey and Micah's cases are definitely connected. I think that James's murder, the timing of it is just coincidental that it occurred so close to Bailey and Micah's disappearances. I don't think that his murder is directly connected to their disappearances in the sense that, he was killed by the same person that was involved in their disappearances, or he was murdered for that the motive directly ties into Micah and Bailey. That's something that over the years, myself and the moms and law enforcement all came to that same conclusion.
Okay. Were the bodies ever found?
It's a complicated answer. There is, how can I say this?
They found a pinky.
A body part was recovered.
Oh, that's horrible. Okay. Okay. Wow. So the moms are still actively investigating. And hey, you've interviewed, I'm assuming you've done extensive interviews on the podcast with the moms.
Yes.
Which is pretty cool.
Yes.
Okay. I'm
sorry. It's hard to talk about the case. It's hard to talk about the case without.
No, I understand. And to be honest with you, there's really not a conclusion at this point. Like there's a partial conclusion, assuming that this is the actual murderer. Because I know most people think, well, someone's found guilty of murder, then they're guilty, but that doesn't necessarily always pan out that way, especially when people want someone to be charged so badly.
Right.
Like it's so much better when they charge you, and you honestly, it's better. I would rather have someone get charged for murder, plead guilty, and take 20 years, then go to trial, never admit what they did, and get life or 30. I'll take the 20 because at least you get to know, yes, this is what happened. I met her at a bar. We spoke several times. I felt she led me on. I became jealous. I stalked her for a week and killed her. Okay, great, fine. But if they charge some guy and there's a loose connection and he never admits and he goes to trial, there's always that feeling like, is this the right person?
Right.
So,
right.
This person obviously didn't admit it.
I have never covered another trial like this where the individual who was on trial ended up, I don't know. I mean, it's hard, ended up taking the stand and talking about what he says happened to the individual that he was charged with murdering.
Right.
So, he did give a version of events, his version of events. So, and we usually don't get that during a trial. You're right. I mean, oftentimes there's, oftentimes a defendant does not testify. That in itself is pretty rare to have that happen during a homicide case. So, homicide trial.
Well, sometimes they'll get that, you might get on the stand because you just don't have any. I can see getting on the stand, you don't have any other choice. The problem is you're not a professional witness.
Right.
But they are professional prosecutors. And even someone who's completely innocent, if you interview them long enough, it starts to become doubtful. And it's like, I didn't even know this person. And does it matter? They ask so many questions in so many different ways. And then they catch you on little tiny lies, or things they say are lies. And before you know it, the jury starts not trusting you. And the truth is, I really don't know the person. You're just not a professional witness. And it's a tough position. So obviously defense attorneys are like, listen, don't get on stand. Like, there's just nothing good can happen. But I can see if it's like, hey, it just doesn't look good. There's too much evidence that the only way is for you to get on the stand and try and explain it away and hope that you're likable and hope that you're trustworthy, or you appear trustworthy. So I could see that, but you're right. It almost never happens.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting when a defense attorney decides that they think it's worth the risk, of what's going to happen under cross-examination. So I have another podcast where we can talk about that case if you want, in a way that's more, we could talk about it more openly, I guess I would say.
Well, let me ask one more question. How many episodes?
So it's 15 episodes. Right. So it's extensive, but I will say quite a few of the episodes are, 20 minutes long. So,
Right. Do you have, and this is are you handling the production and editing yourself, or is there a production company that's handling all of that?
Yes. So I do all the reporting and writing. And then I'm working with the production company Case File Presents. People that love true crime podcasts, a lot of them are familiar with the podcast Case File. So I work with the sound editor that does all the editing for Case File. So someone much more talented than me takes all my reporting and puts it together and makes it sound great, and composes original music for it, all that stuff. So.
How amazing is that, though? Honestly, like I'll hear myself, someone will do something with it and come back, and I'm like, I sound like I know what I'm doing.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, I want to talk about the other podcast, but I want to ask you just kind of a question about true crime and women in general with true crime. And I think I don't know. I think I mentioned this to you. No, I didn't. I didn't. I'm sorry. I mentioned this the other day, but I don't think we weren't speaking. I was speaking with someone else. And I've said this many times. The statistics are, I still have never gotten a definitive answer to this. Do you realize that like 70 to 80% of true crime, violent true crime, is consumed by women?
Yes.
It's like 70, let's say 75%. Serial killers, murders, that sort of thing. Why do you think that is?
Oh my gosh, I have thought about this topic so many times. I think that most women, arguably all women, from the time that we're young enough to to ever be on our own, to ever be anywhere on our own, you're told, be very careful. If you're ever, walking outside, don't talk to strangers. It's installed in you from a very young age that there are bad people out there that can take you and hurt you. And I know that people tell little boys the same thing, but I think for women, it's different because that never goes away, right? For men, maybe you're told that when you're a little boy, but when you're, a 25-year-old man, I don't think you still generally have that same fear if you're out walking alone at night. When you're a woman, you do. And it never goes away, right? You always know in the back of your mind that you could essentially be prey. That there are men out there that, if given the opportunity, will grab you and kill you. So why does that fear translate to a fascination with this? I don't know. I really don't know. But I think that somehow it does. I remember being a teenager, and the first time I saw like a show on TV about, a young woman that was kidnapped and murdered, that I had this mixture of, this, oh my gosh, that could happen to me. But then that feeling also made me not want to turn off the TV. And I find in general that people are, when I'm covering cases, the cases that get the most attention are cases where a majority of viewers feel that they can relate, that they do feel like this could happen to me, right? It's the cases where you don't feel that way that people are usually not interested in, right? Like the average local news viewer is not interested in hearing about the gang member who was shot and killed by another gang member, because they just can't relate in any way. There's no concern. There's no, oh, that could have been me or my kid, or, so I don't, that being said, I don't know what the psychology is behind that. Why is it that things that we can relate to, that are our worst fear, why is that alluring? I don't know, but I think for a lot of women it is.
So my channel, when I started, was 99 to 98%. It was like 98.9 or something for 6 months. The first six months to a year, all male. On you, I am, and I never did anything on murders at all. Like I very seldomly, even still, ever does that ever really come up on the people that I interview. And now I think it's down to like 92% male. But it's true crime. So it's crime, but it's not, violent crime. So it's really odd, I don't know. I have no real insight. And I've read some articles. They don't seem like they have any insight either.
I think it's, I think that society, we have a pretty good understanding today that women are, the majority of true crime consumers. But yes, in terms of why that is, I don't know. I don't know if anyone, but I think about this often. Yeah.
Well, I mean, your explanation is the one that is, I would say, the most prevalent. Does that make sense? Like it's definitely the one they come back to, but it's not the only one. Anyway, so what is the other podcast, and is it based off of one of a story that you looked into?
Yes. So the other podcast is called The Man with a Thousand Faces, and it is based off of another case that I covered in Bakersfield. I actually made the podcast while I was still working in local news in Bakersfield. And the case, it all started with me doing a jailhouse interview with an individual who was awaiting to stand trial for a horrific murder. It was a death penalty case. You know, there was allegations of severe torture involved. And I was a pretty new reporter at that time. I want to say I had been doing this for about a year at that point. And I had sent jailhouse interview requests to other individuals awaiting to stand trial for murder and other crimes, but no one had ever said yes until this specific individual. And I don't even know how to like really put it into words, but for it to be, it wasn't actually just my first jailhouse interview with an accused killer. It was my first jailhouse interview, period. And for it to be this person, his entire face is completely covered with tattoos. And the most noticeable tattoo at the time was he had a Joker smile tattooed on his mouth. He really thinks he's the real life Joker. So I go into this interview having no idea what I'm doing. But I just assume, of course, he's not going to say he did it. And for some background, this was a Friday afternoon, and the suspect, his name is Jamie Osuna. So Jamie Osuna, his trial was supposed to begin on Monday. I'm going to interview him on Friday afternoon. He had been awaiting to stand trial at that point for 6 years. And from what I could find, he had never admitted to the crime, right? So I go in there thinking, I'm going to, again, I had no idea what I was doing. I think I was 24 years old. I thought, I'll ask him some softball questions at first to, warm him up. And then I'm going to try to ask him something that will, kind of trick him into saying something incriminating. I walk in the room with this guy. And first of all, I'm still trying to process this individual that I'm looking at, his face. It's just shocking. It's like looking at a really bad car wreck, his face. You're just well, you can't look away. Before we could even press record on the camera, he said, so yeah, you can ask me whatever you want, but I'm just going to tell you right now, yes, I did it. I'm guilty of the murder, and I'm guilty of a lot of other stuff they don't know about. So what do you want to know? And I'm like, I just remember so clearly thinking, I do not want this guy to think that I'm rattled. I don't want him to think, so I have to act like everything he's saying, like he's talking about the weather, including him saying, I did it. I think I just was like, okay, well, we're going to press record, and then we'll get to that. So yeah, during that interview, I think we were in that room with him for about an hour. He ended up detailing the crime, which is a horrific murder of a woman that was a stranger to him. It was just purely, it was just about him having the opportunity. He said he just wanted to do it. He knew he could. And he described torturing her. And that was, I honestly don't know how I did it. How I sat there and listened to it, especially with such a blank expression on my face. So that happens. So I do that jailhouse interview. And I was interested in learning about his background. How did he get to this point, right? He had told me that he had committed several other murders that law enforcement didn't know about. He'd given me some information about those cases, like little breadcrumbs that I had no idea if they were true or not, but I was very interested in trying to follow up on the possibility that there were other murders he committed, and then understanding how did he become this person that he is today.
Right.
But everything he did was so horrible. Like the woman's family that he murdered, when they went in the courtroom, he would literally wave to them and taunt that, make faces at he just was, I just don't even know how to describe like how horrible he was. He literally got
vile human being.
Yes. And he got so much joy out of inflicting pain on others. So
very sadistic.
Absolutely sadistic. And he loves to say that about himself. That's something that was interesting. I mean, he says, he's like, yeah, I am a sadist. I am sadistic. He said, killing someone gives me a high that is better than any drug, sex, anything. He's like, nothing else could ever give me the same high that killing someone does. And that's, I feed off that high. So he was very open about all of that. So ultimately, I got to a place where I thought, okay, he's so vile, as you so well put, that I don't really know that the world needs to know more about this guy. He's going to prison. He's going to prison for this horrific murder. Maybe let's just close the book on him. I just kind of thought some things might be better left unreported, right? At that point, I had followed up as much as I could on the potential unsolved murders. I'd given law enforcement all the information. So that was that. And then about 2 years later.
Well, when he goes to trial, what happens at the trial?
That's a great question. So it was kind of complicated. Our jailhouse interview, it was such an unusual situation. It was such an unusual situation to get a taped confession, but especially to get a taped confession on the Friday afternoon before a Monday morning trial, right? So we didn't really know what we were going to do at that point. Like no one, at my news station, none of us were expecting that to happen. So we just kind of, I got back to the news station from the jail. It was the end of the work day. And we kind of all thought, all right, well, we're going to sit on this for right now, for sure. And we're going to go to the trial on Monday like we would, if this hadn't happened. So I show up and very quickly, Jamie Osuna's defense attorneys bring up to the judge. They'd found out that I had interviewed him and that he had, made some pretty incriminating statements. They requested that the judge order me to not destroy the interview, but never release it. That they were saying, if this reporter has this information, if she, goes and puts this on the news, this is going to screw everything up. The judge told me, the judge was like, look, I can't tell her what to do, but he strongly cautioned me. He was like, look, this trial, it's taken 6 years to get to this point. And if you put that interview on TV, it could screw things up. So, be careful. And of course I didn't want to do anything like that. I didn't want to jeopardize a trial. So that happens that morning. I then approached the woman's family. Her name's Yvette. I approached Yvette's family, who, again, at that point had been waiting 6 years for this case to go to trial. Jamie Osuna told me during our interview that he wanted to take a plea deal and just have everything go away, whatever. He said he wanted to plead guilty, but that his lawyers wouldn't let him. It's complicated legally, but essentially, since it was a death penalty case, his attorneys you cannot plead guilty, I guess, if you're facing the death penalty. You can't plead guilty to death.
Right.
It's pretty interesting. So anyhow, he explained that to me. He was like, it's ridiculous that there has to be a trial when I'm ready to plead guilty, yada, yada. So I approached Yvette's family and I told them, I was like, look, I just want to let you know that he is saying that he would like to plead guilty. He is not pushing for this trial. I just think you guys should know that. And then they went and spoke with the prosecutor, because they really didn't want to go through a trial either, but they wanted to ensure that he would be, behind bars forever and that he could never hurt anyone else again. So by the end of that day, everyone had come to a decision that the prosecutor would waive the death penalty, and then Jamie Osuna could plead guilty to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So that happens. So he goes to prison. And, there's very much this feeling of, okay, he'll never be able to hurt anyone else again. He's in prison for the rest of his life. And then 2 years later, I get a phone call from one of Yvette's family members. And she told me that Jamie Osuna had been given a cellmate for the first time ever. At that point, he had been incarcerated for, he hadn't been in prison for 8 years, but before he was in prison, he was in jail. So he'd been incarcerated for 8 years. He had never had a cellmate before. They give him a cellmate, and within less than 24 hours, he had beheaded that cellmate and had mutilated his body. I've seen the photos. No matter how many times I looked at the photos, my brain couldn't register that this was real. Every time I would look at it, this isn't real. This isn't real. He had taken the cellmate's blood and written all over the cell, all sorts of things, including, I am a man with 1,000 faces, which is where I got the podcast title from. He had written, ha, 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 a lot of Joker stuff. He had made a necklace with parts of his cellmate. Unbelievable doesn't cover it, right? Unbelievable just doesn't cover it. It's, why was he given a cellmate? How did this happen? They're in the highest security part of the prison. How did this happen? And he had told me during my interview with him that if he was ever given the chance to kill someone again, he would take it. He would take that chance. That was a known thing. And the jails and the prisons, they knew that about him. That's why he never was given a cellmate before. He had attacked, he was always single-celled when he was in jail in Bakersfield. But there was even one time where he was able to get access to another inmate, and he almost killed that inmate. They knew how vicious and dangerous he was. So I really, at that point, felt compelled, even though I'd put the story to rest years earlier, I felt compelled to pick it back up and try to understand how this could have happened. And at that point, I also really wanted to share the story of how it seems Jamie Osuna became, this individual that he was. So, I dug in extensively to his childhood. And then once I started looking in his childhood, I realized that I had to go deeper than that, because with so many people, there's generational abuse and trauma. So then I'm looking at his parents and then their parents, and then the same thing with his victims. It was The looking into the case, it took me in directions that I never expected to go in. That's for sure.
So
that's Amy Osuna.
The roommate, what was his story?
So his cellmate, he had been in prison at that time. I believe it had been around 25 years, maybe a little less than that. And he was going to be going in front of the parole board soon. And he was very hopeful, that he would get paroled. I think he probably would have. He was from, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head where his family moved from, but he had came to America when he was a young teenager with his mom. His mom, was a single mother who then had to spend all her time working to try to be able to give her and her son a better life. They lived in a rough area in Los Angeles where he was quickly introduced to gangs. He became part of a gang, as a teenager. And when he was 17, I believe, he was arrested for shooting a young woman who was at a party where, other members from the rival gang showed up, and she was with, she was part of the other side. Why he shot her, I don't know. But yes, he was convicted. He was convicted of that, and then spent most of his life in prison. And in prison, he had become religious. He'd found God. I read the letters that he had been sending to his family shortly before he was murdered, and he was hopeful for the future. He wanted to have a new life. I mean, and I believe that it's very possible that he was a new person. I mean, at that, he was 17 when he committed this
25 years,
crime.
a long time.
Yeah, it is a long time. So, yeah, I mean, why he was put into that cell with Osuna, it's, a question that I hope will be answered one day.
Okay. Well, you did a kind of a podcast, right?
Yes. But you could, I mean, look, the prison system in California, I mean, it is very hard to get any information from them, especially in a case like this, where there's allegations that someone at the very least really dropped the ball, and it resulted in another inmate being horrifically tortured and murdered and dismembered. There's all sorts of big liability issues there. A lawsuit was filed. So the prison can't, they're not going to say anything, but there were inmates that were on that same cell block that found me. And, it was pretty interesting to hear what they had to say, and they all said, yeah, everyone knew that you can't go into a cell with him. He's not supposed to have a cellmate. We all knew that. And also in that high security area of the prison, they're supposed to be doing checks on the inmates, like, I don't know, I think every 15 minutes or something.
Right.
Or 20 minutes. And there's no way he could have done what he did
in that time.
Yeah, there's just no way. And how no one heard anything. I mean, there's a lot there. Also, something to note, Osuna got his first cellmate the day it was his birthday. So I don't know, that could mean absolutely nothing. I don't know. It's just always a detail that stuck with me. It was his birthday. He gets a cellmate for the first time. And then, the next day.
I have nothing but inappropriate things to think, what must have gone through his mind,
Yeah, I don't.
He was probably excited, like, oh, it's a birthday present. I'm going to.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. I'm sure.
So, did he have a weapon, or did he just overpower this guy?
No, gosh, what was the weapon they found? It was small. I mean, it was small. It was what they found was small. And it was, I can't remember exactly what it was. If it was like a part of a toothbrush that had been made sharp. I mean, it was something like that. It was something where, when that information came out, a lot of people were still really confused how that could have been used to dismember this. I mean, he was fully decapitated. Among other things. So there's that. Also, worth noting, Jamie Osuna is quite petite. He is probably 5'3", and he was listed, like his weight that was listed on all the records was 120 pounds. So, he's a small guy. I remember that was the first thing my eyes went to when I first met him was his face. And then the second thing was, oh, he's not a big guy by any means. So his cellmate was bigger than him.
Yeah, it's odd. Like, I mean, I guess I could see if you were asleep or something, but I would think you would have to have a weapon. That, you're in a pretty vulnerable position when you're sleeping.
Right. No, I'm sure he was. I do believe the cellmate was sleeping when the attack occurred, but still, it's still really hard to understand how this happened.
Okay. And you've done a podcast on this. How many episodes was that?
That podcast is 6 episodes.
Okay.
So, and each episode, I apologize. That episode, that podcast we released in 2019.
Okay. And how long you were going to say how long each episode was?
Oh, no, I was going to say each episode focuses on a different topic. So the first episode, gives the background into, how I came across the story, my initial jailhouse interview with him, the events that took place there. And then the second episode focuses on his relationship with his wife. Jamie Osuna was married. The wife, has some pretty unbelievable stories and insight into who he is. And, she's really the reason why he was caught for anything in the first place. So, which is a fascinating story. The third episode focuses on Jamie's childhood, his upbringing, his family tree. The fourth episode is all about Yvette Pena, who was the woman that he tortured and murdered in Bakersfield. Yeah. The fifth episode focuses on some unsolved murders that he could be connected to. Some of the things he's said. We also focused on his obsession with the Joker. And then the sixth episode is all about the cellmate homicide. You hear from other inmates that were in the same cell block as them, whatnot.
I'm sorry. Do you play excerpts from the recorded interview with him, the first recorded interview?
Yes. That being said, my old station and I agreed, that we would never release some things that he said, right? Like I would never release what he said about torturing and murdering this woman.
Right. Yeah.
That's just so. But yes, you hear from him. What he says about his upbringing, what he says about, why he believes he is the way he is. You hear what he says about these other potential unsolved murders he says he's responsible for, and whatnot.
You would think that he would give very specific details on the other murders. I mean, there's no reason at this point not to. He's got life in prison.
He said that, I asked him that. I'm like, what's the point? And a lot of it, I think he loves this cat and mouse game. He thrives off of it. And he also said something, I can't remember exactly how he worded it, but he was like, at the end of the day, I get to just be left alone with my thoughts, and I get to be the only one that has this information. It's like my little secret that I get to hold on to. The way he worded it was fascinating, actually. I'm not doing a great job of reiterating it, but the gist of it was he really liked knowing that he was the only one that got to know the answers to, what happened to certain individuals.
Okay.
But he even said to me, oh my gosh, when was this? Like a couple years ago? He wanted me to write him a letter and tell him what was going on in my life. At this point, I'd left Bakersfield. I'd moved to Seattle. He wanted to know, write me a letter, tell me about Seattle and your new job there. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And he said, if you were a good reporter, if you really cared about figuring out, the other victims that I murdered and, closing those cases, if you really cared, you'd write a letter.
I was actually thinking you would cultivate that relationship.
Right. He said that. He said, if you were a good reporter, you would do whatever it takes. And you would, no matter how disgusting you think I am, I think he said, even if you're trying not to throw up when you're talking to me, you would still fake it, till you got the answers you're looking for. And I remember just thinking to myself, I can't believe this guy is saying this. And I never did write him a letter. I didn't want to, especially when he's saying that. I'm like, there has to be, I told him, you need to treat me like a professional. I'm not going to tolerate not being treated like a professional. I will take your phone calls. But you need to give me something in return, and he would always say, well, I'm not going to give you anything until you give me something. I mean, it was always a cat and mouse game. And I would say I took his phone calls for probably a full year, before I got to the point where I just was like, this isn't going anywhere.
Right.
This isn't going anywhere. And it's so, I just don't know that what is the benefit of this? What is the benefit of me engaging with this person?
Yeah, you're just encouraging it. Now, I could see if you were trying to build a relationship in order to obtain a goal, but after a year or so, you haven't moved towards that goal.
And it's hard to build a relationship with someone who talks about how, all they want to do is murder people. That's, what fills the hole in their heart. I mean, it's how do you build a relationship with someone like that, right?
Yeah, it's, you got to compartmentalize.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, he got some issues.
He does.
Might make an interesting, I'm not sure. I was going to say might make an interesting kind of a synopsis or a true crime article or something for a magazine. I'm just not sure, I don't know. You'd probably have to be the central character more so than, than him, but not sure where exactly it ends up going.
Right.
Anything else? What else we got? Nothing?
Oh my gosh. I mean, what else do you want to know?
Oh, I mean, I'm good. I mean, do you feel like this is, well, I am curious, like, what are you doing now? You're doing the podcast.
Yes. So the Bakersfield 3 podcast is out. We released all 15 episodes all at once, so people could, binge it if they wanted to. So now that that's done, I'm looking into a handful of different cases, and I'm trying to find a balance between, when I was in local news, I could cover dozens of cases at the same time, because for the most part, a majority of the stories are very brief, not in depth at all. We're talking like 2-minute stories. Now I find myself working on cases where I'm, putting together a 15 episode series on them. So it's incredibly in depth. So I'm trying to find sort of a middle point so I can be still covering cases in depth, but covering more at a time, because there's so many cases out there that really, really, really deserve the coverage. And I strongly believe that there are a lot of cases that that could be solved if given the right attention.
Right. Okay. So your focus is on like solving cold case files, or solving cold case files. What am I saying?
Cold cases.
Cold
Yeah.
cases.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I would say, I've always been very passionate about covering cold cases. But there are cases that are unfolding, now in present day, that a lot of times can benefit from having media involvement, right off the bat. So it's a mix of everything. I have cases that I've covered where, there was a murder trial, the individual was convicted and is serving a life sentence, but, information comes up that, maybe the jury got it wrong, or maybe there's someone else that was involved that hasn't been charged with the crime, So I do a mix of everything, but my passion is covering unsolved cases that appear to have been forgotten about by the general public, and sometimes, by law enforcement. Not forgotten about, but, so many of these law enforcement agencies, they have so many cases and they're so understaffed. It's just logistically impossible the way that the law enforcement agencies are set up for these cold cases to get the time of day.
Right.
And what's so sad is if the resources were there, if there was enough personnel for all of these cases to be assigned an investigator, I really think so many of them would get solved. It's just a matter of no one's looking at them. Right.
So have you zeroed in on one, or you're looking at several?
I'm looking at several right now. Yes. It's hard. There's so many families that they just want a chance. They just want a reporter, an investigator, anyone to just give them a chance and look at their case. So, I find myself spending a lot of my time taking phone calls with victims' families, reading, paperwork that they send me, things like that. So it's hard. I really wish I could cover them all, and I wish I could cover them all in the way that they deserve. Like, I wish I could really dig into all of them really thoroughly. But, you've only got so much time. So that's something that I'm still trying to learn, is how can I best manage my time to cover as many cases as possible in a way that is going to benefit as many cases as possible.
Hey, I appreciate you guys watching. Do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. If you like the video, please hit the bell so you get notified of videos like this. Leave me a comment and check the description box. I'm going to leave a link in the description box to Olivia's podcast. So check the description box, and I really appreciate it. Please consider joining my Patreon, and thank you very much. See ya.